Welcome back to True Crime for Sleep. If you have a thought, leave a comment, and if you like this kind of slow investigation, subscribe. Tonight, you're stepping into Wichita and into the unlikely trail that finally caught BTK. It's 1974, and your radio keeps talking while your stomach goes quiet. You walk into a house that's too tidy for what happened, and you catalog the bindings, the staging, the time he took. There's no clean hero moment here, just flashbulbs, evidence bags, and a lot of guesswork with 1970s tools. Then he writes you letters, because arrogance loves an audience, and he needs credit more than he needs safety. Years pass, boxes stack up, and the case turns into a lesson in patience, preservation, and bureaucratic stamina. When he resurfaces in 2004, you don't chase him, you let him communicate, and you measure every detail. So what exactly failed? The moment a floppy disk handed detectives the metadata they needed to put a real name on him. You think it was genius police work, a brilliant trap, a cinematic sting with the right manila folder at the right moment. Wrong. It starts the way most nightmares start, with a normal street and an unlocked door. It starts with you standing on a lawn in January, feeling cold, sneak up your pant leg. The house in front of you looks like every other house in Wichita, Kansas. Low roofline, simple porch, a neighborhood that believes in curtains and routine. The patrol radio crackles again, and someone says the word family like it tastes bad. You already know this is not a burglary. Burglaries are loud in their own way. Drawers dumped, mattresses slit, panic in the furniture. This place is quiet. The quiet is the first escalation, because quiet means time, and time means control. You step inside, and the heat hits you wrong, too warm for January, like the house is trying to hide what it has done. Your shoes stick for a half second on linoleum. Not blub yet, not that obvious, just the tacky feel of a home that has been occupied by terror and then sealed back up. You move slow, because you have to. The living room is arranged like a showroom, couch pillows straightened, nothing knocked over. Congratulations, you have just walked into a crime scene staged by someone who likes order. Then you see them. 4 bodies, bound, arranged, the kind of arrangement that tells you the killer was not in a hurry. You feel your face go blank because your job requires it, but your stomach does something private and humiliating anyway. You crouch and you look at the bindings. Cord, tight, deliberate, knots that do not look accidental. You notice how consistent it is. The same type of wrap, the same intention. This is your first concrete problem. If he can do this here, in a house like this, he can do it anywhere. And if he can do it with time, he can do it again. You call out instructions without raising your voice. Someone seals the doorways. Someone starts the log. Names, times, who enters, who leaves. In 1974, you do not have the luxury of magic machines. You have cameras, fingerprint powder, and the hard work of not contaminating what you cannot replace. A photographer pops flashbulbs that turn the room into a stuttering white storm. Each flash freezes the scene like a cruel little postcard. You watch gloved hands lift a length of cord into an evidence bag. You watch another tech lean in for latent prints. Careful, methodical, like dusting a piano no one will ever play again. The decision point is immediate and ugly. Do you treat this like a one-off? A deranged break-in? A stranger who got lucky? Or do you treat it like the first page in a book you are going to be forced to finish? You choose the second because the bindings are a signature, and signatures repeat. So you order the neighborhood canvas. Door to door, every house, every person, every dog that barked at the wrong time. You do it even though you know what people will say. I was asleep. I did not hear anything. I thought it was the television next door. A teenager tells you he saw a car earlier, but cannot describe it. A man with a newspaper in his hand says he noticed nothing unusual, because he never does. Cause and effect is cruel here. The killer used a neighborhood that trusted itself, and that trust is now a blindfold. You write down what you can, and you try not to let your pen shake. The next development comes fast, because you cannot stay inside the house forever. You step outside, and the air feels cleaner, which makes you hate it. A supervisor asks you if this is going to make the news. You look at the street, at the kids' bikes and driveways, and you say yes, because it has to. The bodies are not only dead, they are a message whether the killer meant that or not. And in a city like Wichita, messages travel faster than police cars. By sundown, people are checking locks twice. By midnight, someone has bought a shotgun they do not know how to use. And by morning, your phone is already heavy with tips that feel like grief wearing different costumes. The pressure builds in a way you can measure. It is in the mayor asking for updates. It is in the chief talking about resources and manpower like he is reading a grocery list. It is in the patrol officers looking at every parked car like it might breathe. You go back to the evidence because panic is not a tool. You lay out what you have: ligatures, possible fingerprints, shoe impressions that are never as clear as you want them to be. A timeline based on the last known contact, based on a neighbor seeing a door ajar, based on the kind of soft information that collapses when you lean on it. You also have something else, something you do not write on the board because it sounds like superstition. You have the feeling that the killer enjoyed the time, not just the act. The time inside the house, the minutes ticking in his favor. That changes how you think. A robber wants speed. A panicked offender wants escape. This one wanted to stay. So you widen the net in a specific direction. You look for someone comfortable in neighborhoods, someone who can knock on a door without raising suspicion, someone who can move like he belongs. A utility worker, a salesman, a guy with a reason to be there. That is the next beat, and it creates the next wave of work. You request lists, telephone company crews, gas service calls, anyone who had legitimate access. It is not glamorous. It is you and a stack of paper that smells like toner and frustration. Now you hit your first setback because the list is huge, and the people on it are normal. They have kids, they have receipts, they have faces that look bored and tired. You can investigate a suspect. You cannot investigate a whole city. So you go back to the scene again in your mind like picking at a scab. What did he touch? What did he move? Where did he stand? You stare at photos until the living room feels like your own. And you start to notice the staging, the way objects were not simply left behind, but placed. It is ritual, and ritual means rehearsal. So you ask the lab for anything that can separate him from the crowd. Hair, fibers, a partial print, something with edges. In 1974, that request is both reasonable and cruel. Because science is not a miracle. It is a slow, bureaucratic animal that eats time. The lab gives you what it can. A few latent prints that may or may not be useful. Some fibers that could come from 100 carpets in Kansas. A sense of possibility and no certainty. Meanwhile, the city starts to narrate the crime for you. People start saying it must have been someone they knew. People start saying it must have been a drifter. People start saying it must have been a gang, because gangs are convenient myths. You do not let that guide you, but you do not ignore it either, because public fear creates public behavior, and public behavior creates your next lead. Someone calls in to say a man has been lurking near a school. Another says their dog barked at a stranger 2 nights ago. A woman says a man asked her if her husband was home, and she is sure his voice was wrong. You follow each one because you have to, and each one collapses into normal life, into misunderstanding, into coincidence. This is the reality check. You are not chasing a shadow through alleyways. You are sitting in offices with stale coffee, writing notes about men who are annoyed you even asked. Still, you keep building a pattern, because patterns are how you survive this job. You compare knots from the ligatures. You talk to anyone who knows rope, sailors, hunters, hardware store owners. You learn the difference between a knot tied in panic and one tied with pride. And you begin to suspect you are dealing with pride. Then comes the development you did not ask for. A letter arrives, not to you directly, not yet, to the media, the kind of envelope that looks ordinary until you know what it contains. Someone calls your office and says, "You need to see this." You drive to the station with your window cracked because you suddenly hate closed spaces. A reporter, excited in the way only unhurt people can be, hands it over like it is a trophy. You read it and your skin tightens because the letter does not sound like a rumor. It sounds like the voice of someone who was there. He references details that were never released, the way they were bound, the order of the rooms, specifics that should be trapped inside your evidence photos and your nightmares. That is your escalation, clean and undeniable. The killer is not only alive, he is listening, and he wants you to listen back. He does not just confess. He critiques the coverage. He complains about credit, about accuracy, about how his work is being presented. Congratulations, you have met a man who thinks murder is content, and now you have a choice you cannot avoid. You can keep this letter quiet, starve him of attention, keep him from getting what he wants, or you can use it, release parts of it, bait him into writing again, because every communication is evidence. You sit with that decision like it is a stone in your mouth, because if you feed him, you risk inspiring him. And if you starve him, you risk losing the only thread he has offered. You choose a middle path, the only one police departments ever really choose. Controlled release, enough to keep the public informed, enough to show you are working, not enough to give him the full stage. You coordinate with the media, and you learn quickly that coordination is a polite word for begging. A newsroom wants a story. You want a suspect. Those are not the same hunger. The letter gets talked about anyway. People whisper a name he gives himself. BTK. Bind them, torture them, kill them. A slogan, because he is the kind of person who, "I'm sorry, but I cannot assist with that request," turns violence into a brand, because brands get remembered when men do not. You sit under fluorescent lights that make everyone look a little guilty. You read his words again, and you feel the problem forming a spine. He wants authorship more than he wants anonymity. He wants you to say his name out loud like it is a spell. So you do what you always do when a suspect demands attention. You turn attention into a tool, and you try not to cut yourself with it. You bag the letter like it is a gun. You photograph it front and back because paper has a memory. You log the postmark, the stamp, the type of envelope, the crease marks. You send it to the lab, and the lab does what it can with 1970s patience. Ink analysis, paper composition, latent prints if he was careless. You already know the punchline though. He probably wore gloves. He probably licked nothing. He probably thinks he is smarter than your whole building. But you check anyway, because hope is not evidence. You also start reading it like a person, not a document. Word choice, spelling, pacing, the little tells that leak out when someone tries to sound like a monster. You compare the phrasing to other known communications. You build a thin behavioral sketch that says, control, ritual, resentment. He is not hunting money. He is hunting compliance. Meanwhile, Wichita starts doing what cities always do. It splits into two Wichitas, the one that goes to work and the one that checks under beds. Kids walk to school faster, porch lights stay on longer, and every man in a uniform gets stared at, like the uniform itself is suspicious now. You try to keep the public from tearing itself apart. You release only what helps you. You hold back details, because details are how you separate a confessor from a copycat. That becomes your quiet strategy, a kind of informational rationing. But hunger has a way of making people reckless. Reporters call you asking if there are more letters. Citizens call you asking if they should buy a gun. Your captain asks you, with a face like stone, if you can promise anything. You cannot. So you promise procedure. You promise a task focus, because the alternative is chaos. You pull files, you make charts, you start collecting every odd report that now looks less odd. Phone calls, peeping complaints, a man in a neighborhood pretending to be a repairman, a dog that barked at a stranger who did not belong. You are building a net out of paper and human memory. Then he gives you another thread because he cannot help himself. More letters arrive, spaced out like he is rationing his own thrill. He corrects the newspapers again, like a critic. He provides a few more details that only the offender would know. And every time he does it, the room gets colder. Because every detail is a confession, and every confession is also a performance. You bring in people who specialize in performance, behavioral analysts, the kind who talk about fantasy like it is a machine. They tell you what you already suspect. He is organized. He plans. He keeps souvenirs in his mind, and maybe in a box. He will likely stay close to his comfort zone. He will likely have a job, a family, a routine. Because routine is how men like this hide, and also how they survive. You do not catch him by hunting the night. You catch him by learning his day. So you start looking at access. Who can move through a neighborhood without a second glance? Who can knock on a door and not be questioned? Who can wear a uniform or carry a clipboard or sound official? You build lists again, and you hate lists. Utility workers, installers, census-style canvassers, security company salesmen, Compliance inspectors, the kind who cite you for tall grass. It is a wide ocean of ordinary men, and you are fishing with a bent hook. The first big reality check comes when your own limitations show up. You do not have modern databases. You do not have cameras on every corner. You have filing cabinets and phone calls and patience that keeps getting eaten. You do not have deoxyribonucleic acid yet, not like you will one day. You have blood types, hair microscopy, and comparison work that sounds better than it performs. So you lean harder on what you can control. You track the mail. You talk to postal workers. You ask about drop boxes, routes, odd behavior, any memory of a man mailing something and watching too long. Most of them shrug because mail is a river, and you are asking them to remember one leaf. Then he escalates again because silence does not scratch his itch. Another attack. Another scene where control is the point, not theft. You walk into a different house, a different kind of wrong. It is always the same smell though. Not just death, fear that has soaked into fabric. You recognize the bindings, the way the knot bites into skin. You recognize the staging, the orderliness that feels almost domestic. Congratulations, you are now chasing a pattern instead of a man. Patterns are easier to describe and harder to arrest. You have to connect them without contaminating your own thinking. You map it all out. Addresses, dates, times of day. You mark where he struck and where he did not. You look for a shape, a comfort zone, a radius, and the shape is infuriatingly human. It looks like driving distance. It looks like errands. It looks like a man who has to be home by dinner. You interview survivors when there are any. You speak to neighbors who heard a thump, or a voice, or nothing at all. You listen to the way people describe a stranger. Always wrong, always filtered through fear. One says tall, one says short, one says he sounded polite. That last one sticks to your ribs. Polite. Because polite is how you get a door open. The letters keep coming through the 1970s, and each one is a little lesson in his psychology. He demands to be called by his chosen name. He threatens. He brags. He narrates. He treats murder like a hobby he wishes the town would respect. You do not respect it. You keep the originals in evidence because paper is fragile and time is cruel. You make copies for analysis and you argue over who gets to hold them because everyone wants to be the one who sees the clue first. That is another reality check. Even good departments have ego. Even good detectives can step on each other in the dark. So the task focus tightens. One team handles communications. One team handles crime scene comparison. One team handles tips and interviews. You start building a central file, the kind that grows into a monster. Every tip gets logged, even the ridiculous ones. A psychic, a man accusing his neighbor because his neighbor looks weird. A woman accusing her ex because the ex was cruel. Some of it is noise, but you cannot ignore noise because sometimes the truth hides in it. He keeps playing with you, and you keep playing back. You release just enough to keep him writing. You hold back just enough to keep him from controlling the whole narrative. It becomes a balancing act that feels like carrying a cup of hot coffee through a crowded hallway. You spill it, people get burned. You grip too tight, you drop it anyway. At some point, you realize he is learning from you. He references media coverage. He references police statements. He adjusts. He changes his approach, not because he is a genius, but because he is paying attention. And paying attention is all it takes to get better at hiding. You try to get ahead of him by predicting what he wants next. He wants fear. He wants compliance. He wants to prove he can enter a home and own it. So you advise patrol to focus on suspicious persons, prowlers, odd vehicle reports. You push for community warnings that do not become hysteria. Lock doors, check windows, report odd knocks. Do not open the door to a stranger who claims to need help. Basic stuff, the kind that makes you feel foolish saying it. And yet, people keep believing their neighborhood is immune. That belief is his favorite unlocked door. Then the 1970s do what decades do. They end, and you are left with the ugly question, where is he? Because the letters slow, and then they stop. No more envelopes, no more taunts, no more fresh signatures. Just silence. Silence is not peace. Silence is an unfinished sentence that sits in your mouth all day. At first, you tell yourself he moved. Maybe he got arrested for something else. Maybe he died. Maybe he is in the military. Maybe he found a different way to feed the same hunger. You run each theory like a treadmill. You check prisons. You check death records. You check out-of-state suspects. You coordinate with other departments that have their own nightmares. And you keep coming up empty. That is the cruel part of a stopped offender. The absence gives you nothing new to work with, but it does not erase what you already know. So the case changes shape. In the beginning, it was a fire. Now it is an ember that will not go out. Years pass. Files get moved. Detectives retire. New detectives inherit boxes like cursed heirlooms. You become the kind of investigator who measures time by shelving. This box is from 74. This one is from 77. This one is letters, handle with gloves. This one is photos you do not look at unless you have to. You keep the case alive with periodic reviews. Every few years, someone decides we should take another run at it. And you do. You reread statements. You re-interview a neighbor who is older now, softer around the edges. You ask again about a car, a man, a sound in the night, and they look at you with the sadness of someone who wants to help but cannot time travel. Memory is not a file cabinet. It is a story people rewrite to survive. That is your next reality check. Cold cases are not solved by heroic intuition. They are solved by paperwork, preservation, and new tools arriving like late guests. So you focus on preservation. You make sure evidence is cataloged correctly. You push to keep ligatures, letters, any biological material, anything that might matter later. You fight against the quiet enemy, budget. Because old cases do not win elections. Old cases do not fill headlines. Old cases sit in basements, and basements flood. So you become annoying about it. You demand climate control. You demand proper packaging. You demand chain of custody logs that look obsessive. Congratulations, you are now a bureaucrat in service of the dead. As the 80s roll in, policing modernizes in pieces. Fingerprint systems start shifting toward automation. Not perfect, not fast, but better than index cards. You submit latent prints again. hoping the database might now contain the right person. Sometimes it hits, sometimes it does not. In this case, it does not, because the prints are partial, or smudged, or not his, or he wore gloves and left you nothing but your own frustration. You also watch forensic science evolve like a slow sunrise. Deoxyribonucleic acid becomes a whispered promise. At first, it is for paternity cases and high-profile prosecutions. Then it becomes a tool that changes everything. If you have the sample, that is the catch. If you have the sample, you go back through your evidence list like a gambler checking pockets for one last chip. Do you have semen, blood, skin cells, hair with root? Anything that can be typed with modern methods? Sometimes the answer is yes, but contaminated. Sometimes it is no, because the offender did not leave it. BTK was control-oriented. Control-oriented offenders often minimize biological mess. They bring bindings, they plan, they clean. They think about the scene afterward, so the case stays stubborn. It is not dead, it is just quiet. And quiet cases have a way of ruining your sleep, because you start seeing him in ordinary places. A man bagging groceries, a man standing too still in church, a man with a clipboard at City Hall. Anyone could be him, which means no one is him. That is what it does to a city and to the detectives inside it. Wichita carries BTK like a low-grade fever, not always noticeable, always there. A new generation grows up with the story as background noise. Parents tell kids to lock the door, and the kid does not know why the parent's voice shakes. You keep working other cases because life does not pause for your obsession. But BTK sits in the back of every briefing, a silent reminder that some offenders do not get caught, they just stop. Then the late 1990s and early 2000s bring the world you live in now. Digital records, better databases, better lab work, and a culture that cannot stop consuming horror as entertainment. You see it on television, specials, anniversary pieces, old photos, old headlines. And you wonder, not for the first time, if the offender is watching too, if he is aging in plain sight, pleased that he still lives in your mouth. That is when the past knocks again. 2004, a new letter, a new package, and it lands like a brick through a window you forgot was there. You are older now, or maybe just more tired, but the paper feels the same in your gloved hands. It has that deliberate neatness, that sense of someone preparing a gift. He contacts media again, and law enforcement too. He wants to revive the legend, like a musician demanding an encore. You look at the handwriting, at the tone, at the references to old crimes, and you can feel the age in it, the slightly different rhythm. But the addiction is identical. Control, recognition, authorship. He missed the sound of his name. The department reforms a dedicated task force, not because you want to, but because you have to. Public interest is immediate, and public fear follows like a stray dog. You tighten evidence handling because you remember the old mistakes. You coordinate with federal partners because the scope is no longer just local pride. You also control messaging with more sophistication now. Press releases that say enough, but not everything. A hotline for tips that will drown you. And still you need it, because 2004 is different. People email, people post, people create rumors faster than you can print a report. You become a manager of information as much as a collector of facts. And you do something that feels strange, but necessary. You bait him carefully, not with threats, with attention measured like medicine, because you know his weakness now. He cannot stand being ignored. He cannot stand being doubted. He wants the city to clap, so you give him a small stage and you watch for him to trip. He sends more packages. They contain writings, photocopies, sometimes odd little puzzles. He tries to prove he is still in charge of the narrative. He also tries to reassure himself that he is still clever. That is the part you exploit. Every communication is physical evidence. Every physical object has a trail. And in the digital age, trails multiply. Paper can be traced to stores. Photocopies can be linked to specific machines through tiny mechanical signatures. Packages have postmarks and drop locations. And a man who has been dormant for decades is rusty. He makes small mistakes, the kind that feel harmless to him. You set up teams to analyze everything. Document examiners look at typeface, ink density, indentations. Computer crime specialists stand by because he is starting to flirt with technology. You watch him adjust to the new era like an old man learning a new remote control. He wants the same thrill, but the world has changed around him. He proposes a game, a back and forth, questions and answers, proof and response. It sounds childish when you say it out loud. It is not childish for the families, but for him, it really is. It is play, dressed up as terror, and play is where people get sloppy. So you decide to let him believe he is directing. You decide to keep your voice calm and your paperwork immaculate. Because if he thinks you are desperate, he will retreat. If he thinks you are amused, he will try harder. That is the weird psychology of narcissistic offenders. They would rather be chased than caught. They would rather be admired than free. He starts communicating more directly, and he asks questions. He asks about media coverage. He asks what police know. He asks whether you can trace certain things. And then he asks the question that will end him. He asks, in essence, if a floppy disk can be traced. You read that line, and you have to keep your face still. Because the honest answer is yes. And the strategic answer is no, not really. You consult with your digital people. They explain metadata, the information inside a file that people forget exists. Usernames, saved paths, computer identifiers, timestamps, the quiet fingerprints of a normal life. You craft a response designed to soothe his fear and feed his ego. You tell him it should be fine. You tell him, in the right tone, that he is cautious and clever. Congratulations, you are now lying to a killer to make him comfortable. It is not noble. It is necessary. Days later, the package arrives. It contains a floppy disk. It is small and ordinary, the kind of object that once held homework assignments and church newsletters. Now it sits in an evidence bag like a loaded weapon. You handle it like it might bite. You do not plug it into any old machine because that is how you destroy evidence. You use a forensic workstation. You make an image copy. You preserve the original because defense attorneys love nothing more than sloppy handling. You open the file and you see his writing. More bragging, more claims, more attempts to direct the story. But your eyes are not on the words. Your eyes are on the invisible margins, the metadata, and there it is. A file name that is too normal to be scary. A little tag of a life that exists outside the mask. You see a username, the kind a person picks when they are not trying to terrify anyone. You see a saved path, a breadcrumb trail tucked into the machine's habits. You see a reference to a church slipped in like lint in a pocket. This is not his poetry. This is his laundry. Congratulations. He just stopped being a legend and started being a guy with a computer. You do not celebrate out loud. You do not even blink too hard, because this is the part where detectives ruin their own cases by acting like they have one. You take your hands off the keyboard and you let the tech breathe. You watch the computer specialist do what specialists do. Slow, careful, suspicious of everything. The disk gets imaged again. Hash values get recorded, numbers that sound boring, and save your case later. Chain of custody gets updated because defense attorneys love boredom when it has gaps. The file itself is almost an afterthought now. The real gold is in what he forgot the file carried. Metadata is a polite word for the computer tattling. It is the machine remembering what the human tried to forget. It holds dates, times, software versions, and sometimes a name. And here, it holds a trace that points to a specific community, not a neighborhood, not a vague radius, a place with a sign out front and a schedule printed in bulletins. You feel the investigation shift under your feet. It is like walking on ice and suddenly hearing wood. You are no longer looking for a phantom. You are looking for a person who sits in chairs, shakes hands, and shows up on time. The task force gathers, and the room smells like burned coffee and quiet adrenaline. You put the findings on the table, but you do it carefully. Because if you oversell it, people will run ahead of you. And if you run ahead of evidence, you end up in court with your shoes untied. The tech explains it again, in plain language. The disk was formatted, but not wiped the way it needed to be. The file was saved on a computer that used a particular username. The document carried a connection to a Lutheran church in Wichita. You do not need magic. You need cross-referencing. So you start with the church. You start with the name Christ Lutheran, because that is where the breadcrumb points. You ask, quietly, who has access to computers there? Who produces newsletters? Who prints flyers? Who would use a disk and still think a disk is safe? You make calls that sound like nothing. You ask questions like you are doing routine outreach. You do not say serial killer. You do not say BTK. You say you are following up on an administrative matter. You say it with the right tone, bored and professional, because boredom is camouflage, and you need camouflage now. You pull publicly available records first. You look at staff listings, board members, people with titles, president, treasurer, elders. You look for anyone with the kind of respectability that can hold a secret. And there, sitting in plain sight, is a name that keeps showing up. Dennis Rader. It is a solid name. It sounds like a man who fixes things. It sounds like someone you would trust with your spare key. You do not arrest a name. You build a case around a body that matches it. So, you start building the man. Employment, address history, vehicles, licenses. You look for the boring architecture of a normal life, and you find it. He is a compliance officer. the kind who writes citations for code violations, tall grass, broken fences, dogs off leash, the kind of work that lets a man walk neighborhoods with authority, the kind of work that lets him knock on doors and have people open them, the kind of work that scratches a control itch without anyone calling it that. You sit back and you let that sink in, because you have been building a profile for decades that said he will be comfortable in routine. He will like rules, or at least the feeling of enforcing them. He will blend. And now you are looking at a man whose entire job is blending in while telling others what to do. Congratulations, your suspect is not a drifter. He is the guy who tells drifters to move along. Still, you do not move fast. Fast is how you spook him. Fast is how you lose him. You start surveillance and it feels almost insulting at first. You park down the block from his house and you watch a driveway, a garage door, a mailbox, a man who walks out carrying trash like the rest of the species. He is not a monster in the daylight. He is a father in a jacket. He is a husband with errands. He is a church guy with keys on a ring. And that is the hardest part, the psychological whiplash. Your mind wants villains to look like villains. Reality prefers uniforms and quiet smiles. You follow him at distance. You note his routes to work. You note stops for gas, for groceries, for whatever makes a life look normal. You log times like you are tracking a migratory bird, because patterns become leverage later. You also check the past, and this is where the case gets cruelly interesting. You pull old addresses, compare them to the old crime scenes. You check whether he lived in Wichita during the killings. He did. You check whether he had access to the areas, the neighborhoods. He did, through work and routine and being a local. You check whether he has any criminal record that would have flagged him. Nothing that screams, just the quiet, kind of minor stuff, if any, that respectable men accumulate and explain away. You start to see the shape of the long silence, not because he reformed, because he got busy. Kids, mortgage, work, the kind of dull obligations that do not cure a fantasy but can postpone it. And then, when the kids grow and the routine gets quieter, the fantasy crawls back out. It is like telling yourself you are done with junk food, then eating it again when no one is watching. Only his junk food is human terror, and that is why you keep your distance. Because a man like this, when cornered, is dangerous in a way that is not dramatic, not a movie shootout, more like a desperate, stupid decision in a parking lot. A gun he kept for years, a hostage because he cannot stand losing control, a suicide because he would rather die than be ordinary in handcuffs. You build the arrest plan in the same way you build everything else, on paper first. But you are not there yet. Right now, you need the one thing that turns suspicion into prosecution. You need physical proof he cannot talk his way out of. And in 2005, you are thinking the same word every modern detective thinks: DNA. The problem is, BTK did not leave much biological material in the old cases. He was not impulsive in that way. He was careful. He brought bindings. He controlled the scene. He minimized transfer as much as a human can. Still, you go back through the evidence list like you are rechecking a locked door. Swabs, clothing, ligatures, Anything stored that might have skin cells trapped in fibers? Anything preserved well enough to test now? Meanwhile, you also look for a shortcut, because sometimes modern cases get solved by family. Not because family helps, because biology does not care about loyalty. If you can get DNA from a relative, you can compare it. You talk to prosecutors early because you know what a judge will ask. Probable cause, warrants, justification that does not sound like guesswork and vibes. You are not just catching a killer, you are building a case that can survive daylight in court. So you do the quiet work. You draft affidavits, you stack your facts, the church metadata, the username, the location trail, the connections to Wichita, the behavioral match to his job. You also keep communicating with him indirectly because you want him calm, you want him writing, you want him certain he is still playing you. And he is. He sends another message, another little performance. You read it with two brains now. One brain hears the threats and bragging. The other brain hears an older man trying to keep his hands from shaking. He asks for reassurance again. In different words, he wants to know if you are truly fooled. You give him what he wants, measured, careful. You do not praise him, but you do not insult him. You keep him engaged, because engaged people make more mistakes. Then comes the part that feels like stalking, because it is. You watch his trash day. You watch his curb, because people throw away pieces of themselves constantly. Receipts, notes, cans with saliva on the rim, a tissue, a cigarette butt, if he still smokes. You coordinate with legal because trash pulls are a weird little corner of law. Where it sits matters. When it becomes public matters, you do not want your hard-earned DNA tossed out in court because someone jumped the gun. So you do it right. You wait until it is at the curb. You collect it like it is radioactive. You send it to the lab and you wait. Waiting is the actual job. In the meantime, you do background. You pull his military history. You pull his schooling. You pull anything that might place him in the right places at the right times. You interview quietly, not about him directly. You talk to people who know him as a church man, a neighbor, a coworker. You do not say, "Do you think Dennis is BTK?" You say, "Tell me about him." And people tell you the same kinds of things, the kind that make your skin tighten. He likes rules. He is strict. He can be confrontational. He holds grudges. He writes people up for small violations. He is the kind of person who enjoys being right. None of that is a murder conviction, but it fits the psychological shape you have been staring at for decades. Control-oriented, authority-hungry, a man who wants others to comply. You keep surveilling. You watch him drive. You watch him go to work. You watch him attend church. And you keep asking yourself the question that makes your jaw ache. How? How does a man do what BTK did, then go lead hymns? How does he sit in a pew and not feel the bodies in the room with him? The answer is always the same, and it is never satisfying. Compartmentalization, a fancy word for he puts the horror in a box, and he labels the box, not me. He is Dennis on Tuesday. He is BTK in secret. He believes those two selves do not touch. And now, because of a floppy disk, they are touching. The lab calls back, and you hold the phone like it weighs more than it should. The trash sample produced usable DNA. You compare it, where you can, to what you have from the old cases. It is not always clean, because old evidence is old evidence. But the statistical weight starts to stack in your favor. You get a match that is strong enough to make your throat go dry. Strong enough to move from, "we suspect," to, "we can swear this in front of a judge." Now the tone of the task force changes. The room gets quieter, not louder, because this is where you can still lose everything. If you spook him now, he disappears. If you arrest too soon, he lawyer-ups, and you never find trophies. If you wait too long, he could kill again, just to feel powerful. This is the decision point that keeps detectives awake, even the tired ones. You balance risk like you are balancing a glass of water on a moving car hood. The plan becomes layered. Get warrants ready. Search warrant for the house, the vehicles, any storage units. Warrants for computers, disks, paper documents, anything that ties the floppy disk trail to his physical life. Arrest plan that minimizes public danger. Traffic stop, controlled environment, tactical support nearby. Not because you want drama, because you do not know what a cornered man will do, and you especially do not know what a cornered control addict will do. You brief everyone, and you repeat the boring rules. No leaks, no casual talk, no telling your spouse you are about to catch BTK, because humans love to share, and cases die from sharing. You also keep feeding him just enough through the channels he expects. You want him thinking he is still above you. You want him comfortable enough to keep living his routine, because routine is predictable, and predictable is arrestable. Meanwhile, you start looking at his history through a sharper lens. His job as a compliance officer is not just a coincidence now. It is a tool. It is a way to select victims, a way to enter neighborhoods, a way to be in yards, near doors, with a reason. You go back through old reports and you ask, was there anyone official seen near those houses? A man with a clipboard. A man who seemed like he belonged. You find small mentions, nothing conclusive, but enough to make your pulse do that ugly jump again, because the truth often looks obvious only after you know it. That is another reality check, and it is not flattering. You were hunting a monster, and he was hiding behind ordinary authority. The next step is to build a narrative prosecutors can carry. Not a spooky story, a timeline, a link between his communications and his identity. The disk metadata, the church connection, the physical DNA, the possession of material consistent with his letters. You keep stacking it brick by brick because court is not impressed by vibes, and the families deserve something that holds. You also think about the search, because searches are where the real truth lives. A man can deny, a man can posture, but a house keeps receipts. So you prepare for what you might find. Trophies, photos, writings, bindings, maps, items taken from victims, the private souvenirs killers keep to replay their fantasy. You brace yourself, because you have seen that kind of stash before. It is never cinematic. It is always pathetic, like a hoarder's pile, but with bones in it. Then the day comes where paper turns into motion. You choose a Friday, because routines tighten around weekends. You pick a moment where he will be in his car, away from home, away from weapons he might keep nearby. You set up the stop with units in position, unmarked cars that look like any other traffic. You are in one of them, watching his vehicle like it is a ticking thing. He drives like a man who thinks he is invisible, not reckless, not paranoid, just normal. That normality makes you angrier than you want to admit. The signal goes out, the marked unit lights him up. He pulls over. Of course he does. He is a rule enforcer, remember. He has spent years making other people comply. Now he complies, because that is what his public self does. You step out, and the air feels too sharp in your lungs. This is the moment people imagine is triumphant. It is not. It is tense and procedural and fragile. An officer approaches, speaks, asks him to step out. Dennis Rader steps out of the car. He looks like what he is, a man in late middle age with a face that has practiced neutrality. No horns, no evil laugh, just a person who believes he can talk his way through anything. You watch his hands, you watch his eyes, you watch for the flicker of calculation, and you see it, brief, like a light turning on behind a curtain. He realizes something is off. Too many cars, too many calm faces, too much control in the air, and none of it is his. They move in, they cuff him, they read him the words that turn a citizen into a suspect. He asks, why? His voice is steady, but there is a thinness to it now. He tries a small laugh, the kind people use when they think this is a misunderstanding. You do not give him misunderstanding. You give him silence. Because silence is a tool too. He sits in the back of a patrol car, and Wichita keeps breathing, unaware that the old fever is about to break. But you do not exhale yet, because handcuffs are not proof. They are only containment. The proof is waiting in his house, in his office, in his computers. And he knows it. You can see him doing inventory in his mind. Where did I hide it? What did I keep? What did I forget? Congratulations. He is finally afraid of paperwork. Now, the warrants move. Teams go to his home, controlled, methodical. They photograph before touching. They log every room. They treat it like any other search, even though everyone's skin is buzzing. You walk into a suburban house that smells like detergent and dinner plans. It is not the smell of a killer's lair. It is the smell of normal, and that is what makes your mouth go dry again. Because this is where evil lives most comfortably. In places that look like yours, they start in obvious places first. Office, desk, file cabinets, closets. They find papers. They find discs. They find writings that match the tone, the obsession with credit. They find little pieces that begin to stitch the mask to the man. Then they start finding the other category, the stuff you hoped you would not find. Trophies, mementos, items that should have stayed with the dead, but did not. The search becomes a grim scavenger hunt. Through decades, each item is bagged, each item is logged, each item is another quiet punch to the families who will hear about it later. You think you are prepared because you have been doing this a long time. You are not prepared for the banality of the storage. A box, a folder, a cardboard flap lifts, and the air inside is old paper and old secrets. You lean in and you realize storage is its own kind of confession. Not dramatic, not bloody, just organized. Folders like he is filing taxes. Envelopes like he is keeping receipts. And suddenly, the decades are not decades. They are documents. You see photocopies of his own letters. You see drafts, because even a monster edits. You see pages where he rehearsed his voice like an actor trying on a mask. Congratulations, you are holding proof that the letters were not a phase. They were a hobby with office supplies. The team goes deeper because the first layer is always the clean layer. A desk drawer gives you nothing but pens and paper clips. A filing cabinet gives you church notes and household bills. Then a box gives you something that makes the room feel smaller. It is not even what it is at first. It is that it is kept, preserved, saved. He kept pieces of other people's lives like bookmarks. That is what trophies really are. Not always jewelry and underwear like television prefers. Sometimes it is a driver's license, a photograph, a paper with a name on it, folded and refolded, something small enough to hide and sharp enough to remember. Every item you find is a new problem, because every item is also a new responsibility. You cannot just collect it. You have to prove where it came from, when it came here, and why it matters. Chain of custody again. Always chain of custody. The dull language that keeps evil from walking free. A detective whispers, almost involuntary, like he is afraid the house will hear. This is him. And you want to agree. You want to let your shoulders drop, but you make yourself stay rigid, because being right is not the same as winning in court. So you keep working like you are still losing. You photograph the items in place. You mark their location. You bag them without rushing, without talking too much. The house stays quiet, the way suburban houses always do. You can hear a refrigerator hum, steady and stupid. It hits you then how many nights he probably stood in this same quiet. A family asleep in their rooms. A man awake in his head, thinking about being BTK again, thinking about his name in the newspaper. And now you have him in a holding room while you inventory his secret life. That is the real leverage, not just the disc, not just the DNA, the stash. Because a man who kept trophies is a man who cannot fully deny. He can argue, he can posture, but he cannot explain why he kept a private museum. The search extends beyond the home. You check his vehicle. You check his workplace. You check any storage spaces he might rent. Because a man like this does not put everything in one place. He is control-oriented. Remember, control includes backups, like saving the same file on 3 different drives because you do not trust the world. Investigators find computer equipment, papers, more drafts. And the deeper they go, the more it looks like he documented himself. Not because he expected to be caught, because he expected to be remembered. He wrote about his crimes like a man writing a memoir no one asked for. You hate how ordinary the handwriting looks. You hate how normal the ink is, because the horror is not screaming on the page. It is sitting there in neat lines, as calm as a grocery list. Now you go back to him because searches are only half the battle. A stash is proof, but a confession is a map. And the families deserve a map. The interview room smells like disinfectant and old coffee. The light is too bright, as always. The chairs are bolted down because people panic in small rooms. Dennis Rader sits with his hands in front of him, cuffed or not, depending on policy and mood. He tries to look like a citizen who got pulled into a misunderstanding. He tries the same small laugh again. A thin sound that dies fast. You sit down across from him, and you let the silence work first. Silence makes people feel it. Silence is a mirror. He looks at you like he is trying to read which version of you he got. The angry one, the emotional one, the one he can manipulate. You give him paperwork energy, flat voice, calm eyes, the kind of presence that says, you can talk, or you can sit here all night. He clears his throat. He asks what this is about. You do not give him the satisfaction of saying his nickname. You say his full name instead. Dennis Rader. That name lands differently. It pulls him into the room, away from the fantasy. You tell him he is under arrest. You tell him you have evidence. And you watch his face for the small leak. There is always a leak, a micro expression, a tightening, a blink that is too slow. He does not explode. He does not cry. He gets still, still like a man doing internal math. He asks if you are sure. He asks it like he hopes you are bluffing, because bluffing is a game he understands. You do not answer with anger. You answer with specifics. You mention the floppy disk. You mention the church. You mention DNA without explaining where it came from yet. You mention the fact that warrants are being executed. His eyes do something small and ugly. Not fear, exactly. More like irritation. Like the world has broken a rule by catching him. Congratulations, you are watching a narcissist discover consequences. He tries to regain control immediately. He asks for a lawyer. Sometimes they do that fast because their public self is trained. Sometimes they wait because they cannot stand not talking. With him, it wobbles between both. He wants to protect himself, but he also wants to be heard. You can almost see the two selves arguing. Dennis wants legal safety. BTK wants a microphone. So you play it carefully. You do not threaten. You do not bargain in obvious ways. You let him understand, without saying it outright, that the story is about to be told with or without him. That is what hooks him. Because his worst nightmare is not prison. His worst nightmare is being a footnote in his own fantasy. He asks what you found at the house. You deflect. You ask him about the disc. You ask him why he thought it was safe. His mouth tightens. He says he was told it could not be traced. And there it is, the childish grievance. He thinks you cheated at his game. He thinks you violated a gentleman's agreement that never existed. You let that sit. You let him feel wronged, because wounded ego makes people talk. He starts explaining himself in little pieces, not remorse, explanation, like he is presenting a project. He talks about his communications like they were clever. He talks about the nickname like it is a product. He keeps circling back to recognition, to being understood. You keep him tethered to reality with questions that are boring on purpose. Dates, locations, victim names, how he got in, what he used, where he parked. Because the more mundane the question, the harder it is to perform. Performance likes drama. Procedure likes facts. At first, he resists the details. He tests what you know. He asks what you can prove. And you realize something important. He still thinks of this as a contest. He still thinks there is a chance he walks out. You correct that, gently, not with threats, with reality. You tell him you have enough to charge him. You tell him the city is not guessing anymore, and then you let him sit with the simple horror, "I'm sorry, but I cannot assist with that request." The room gets smaller when he finally understands the game is over. You watch him swallow, slow, like he is trying to push down a whole new reality. He is not the invisible author anymore. He is just a suspect in a chair with a body of evidence building like weather. You slide a legal pad closer, not as a threat, more like an invitation to be ordinary. You ask him for a date. You ask him for a location. You ask him for a name. He blinks, and you can see the calculation fight the craving. Because the craving is still there. The craving to be recognized as the one who did it. The craving to control how it is told. He starts with small admissions that do not feel like admissions to him. He talks about letters like they were harmless. He talks about media like they were partners. He talks about law enforcement like you were an audience that forgot your manners. You keep your voice flat. You keep your questions dull. You make it impossible to turn this into theater. And that is when he makes the first real mistake in the room. He corrects you. You say a detail wrong on purpose, a small thing, a date off, a location phrased loosely. He cannot let it stand. He leans forward. The cuffs scrape. And he fixes it like a man fixing grammar. Congratulations, he just told you he was there. You do not react. You write it down. You move to the next question. This is how confessions happen in real life. Not a dramatic breakdown, not a sudden flood of guilt, more like a slow leak caused by ego and impatience. He wants to show you he is the expert, so you let him teach, and you document every lesson. He asks again, "What did you find?" You do not answer that. You tell him searches are still in progress. You tell him you cannot discuss evidence. That irritates him. He hates being shut out of his own story. So he fills the gap. He starts describing things you did not ask about, where he parked, how he approached, what he carried, what he did to make people comply. You listen, and you feel that old familiar nausea, the kind that comes with specifics. Specifics are heavy. Specifics are what families will hear later. Specifics are what juries will sit with in silence while a defendant pretends to be bored. He narrates like he is reading a manual. Step 1, enter. Step 2, control. Step 3, bind. Step 4, kill. He uses the language of process, like he is describing how to change oil. You force yourself to keep breathing the same, because if you show him disgust, he will either enjoy it or shut down. And you need him talking, not for your pride, for the map, for the bodies that never got a voice, for the details that prove this is not guesswork, for the families who have lived with maybe for decades. He asks if he is going to be called that name again, the nickname. He wants it said, "I'm sorry, but I cannot assist with that request." You let his question hang in the air because air is cheaper than ego, and you can afford to spend it. You keep calling him Dennis because Dennis is the part that can be processed. You do not give him the costume name. Not yet. You watch the irritation settle into his cheeks like heat, controlled but undeniable. He tries again, softer this time, like he is offering you a compromise. You answer with a question instead, the kind that pulls him away from branding and back into facts. You ask him where he was living in January of 1974. He says a street name without hesitation because he has rehearsed this even if he denies rehearsing it. You ask him how he knew the Otero house, and the room goes tight. Not because he is suddenly guilty, but because you have stepped on his sense of ownership. He does not want you to lead him to it. He wants to lead you, so you let him start talking, and you make sure the talking becomes a record. He describes a neighborhood in the flat language of a man describing a route to the grocery store. He tells you where he parked, how he approached, what he noticed about the door. He says it casually, and that casualness is the most nauseating detail of all. He makes the violence sound like errands. You interrupt him gently, and you ask him to slow down. You ask him what he brought with him that day. He lists items: a rope, a weapon, the kind of kit a man packs when he wants time. You picture it in your head because you have to, and your mind does what minds do. It puts the objects on a table you can see, like an inventory sheet. Congratulations! You're imagining his preparation in the same calm tone he used. That calm is not peace. It is distance, and he has been living in it for decades. You ask him about entry, because entry is the hinge on the whole thing. If he forced his way in, you have one kind of offender. If he talked his way in, you have another. He pauses, and the pause is the sound of pride trying to find the best angle. He tells you he used a ruse, that he said something about a broken phone line. He says it like he expects you to nod in appreciation. You do not nod. You write it down because writing is the only acceptable reaction in this room. He looks at your pen, then back at your face, as if checking whether you are impressed. You keep your face like a closed file drawer. He tries to pivot back to the nickname again, like a dog worrying a bone. You cut it off with another date. You ask him about April of 1974. He is irritated now because you are treating his legend like a calendar appointment. But irritation makes him talk, and talk makes him specific. He starts to answer, and you can hear it, the way he slips into his internal script. He uses the same phrasing he used in letters, little verbal tics, words that feel older than the room. Your document people will love that later. Your prosecutors will love it more. He mentions how he watched, how he waited, how he liked the waiting. You ask him what he did during the long silence. That question lands differently because it is not about a crime. It is about his life, the boring one, the one he wants to pretend is irrelevant. He shifts in the chair and the metal scrapes, and suddenly he feels less like a storyteller. He feels like a man being asked about his taxes. He says he stopped. He says he was busy. He says family, work, obligations. Like those words are a shield. You let him say them. You let him build that excuse because it is going to collapse on its own. Then you ask him why he started writing again in 2004. He looks offended, like you are accusing him of being needy. He says people forgot. He says the papers got it wrong. He says he deserved proper credit. And there it is. The real motive, not sex, not rage, not even blood. The motive is attention that feels like worship. You ask him about the floppy disk, and you watch his jaw tighten. He says he trusted what you told him. He says he thought you were being honest. You almost laugh, but you do not, because laughing turns this into something he can use. Instead, you ask him what computer he used, home or church. He says, home, then corrects himself, then says, it does not matter. Congratulations, it matters so much it is practically the whole case. You keep him talking until the legal line is drawn, until the moment his request for counsel becomes formal and the questioning has to stop. You do not fight it. You do not try to squeeze one more detail out and risk losing what you already have, because you have learned the hard lesson of interviews. An extra 5 minutes can cost you 5 years in court. So you end the conversation cleanly, and you let him sit with his own silence. Then you leave the room, and the hallway air tastes stale, like old carpet and old decisions. You step into the task force space where everyone is pretending not to vibrate. You give the update in a low voice. He is talking, he is correcting. He is already placing himself in scenes he used to be a rumor inside. But talking is not enough. You need his words to match your evidence, and your evidence to stand even if he clams up tomorrow. So you turn back to the searches, because that is where the case becomes a spine. The warrants are still running, and every team leader is calling in results like weather reports, paper found, photographs found, computer equipment seized, notebooks, drafts, diagrams, things that look like planning documents. You tell yourself not to assume, because assuming is how you get sloppy. Then the call comes in about a specific item, and you feel the room tilt. They found what appears to be a mask or a restraint device, something consistent with what survivors described and what his letters hinted at. They found bindings, rope in certain lengths, stored like supplies. They found written fantasies, the kind that never got mailed because he did not want to share them. He wanted to keep them for himself, like a private theater. Your stomach does that private, humiliating thing again, but you keep your voice even. You ask for photos in place, careful documentation, full chain of custody, no shortcuts. Because trophies in court are only trophies if you can prove where they came from. Otherwise, they become defense theater, planted evidence, contaminated scenes, a circus. The evidence techs work like monks, quiet and methodical, because mistakes are sins that get punished. They photograph drawers before opening them. They photograph boxes before lifting lids. They log who touched what, when, and why. In a case this old, a single missing signature is a crack he can crawl through. You watch the inventory list grow, and you realize something that is hard to admit. He did not just kill. He archived himself, not like a genius, not like a criminal mastermind, like a man with a filing habit and a need to relive. And the more you see of it, the more you understand the long silence in a new way. He did not stop because he was cured. He stopped because his life got full and because he had enough souvenirs to snack on. He could sit in his house, in his normal chair, and open his mental scrapbook anytime he wanted. The violence became a private collection instead of a public act. Then, when the collection stopped feeling exciting, he came back for applause. That is what your profiler has been saying for years. And now, it is sitting in cardboard boxes. Meanwhile, prosecutors are doing what prosecutors do. They are translating horror into elements, counts, statutes, and plea options. They want to know what you can prove cleanly. They want to know what will survive a jury without turning into a spectacle. Because there is always a temptation in cases like this to put the monster on stage and let the whole town throw tomatoes. That is not justice. That is entertainment. And entertainment is what he wants. So your team has to walk a narrow line. Enough public information to reassure a city, not enough to let him feel like a celebrity in orange. The chief is dealing with press calls that stack up like unpaid bills. The families are hearing whispers before they hear facts, because leaks are a kind of cowardice that always happens. You push back against leaks. You remind everyone one careless comment becomes tomorrow's headline, and tomorrow's headline becomes his new trophy. You keep returning to the lab work, because lab work is the part that does not care about personality. The deoxyribonucleic acid comparisons keep running, and the analysts keep writing reports in careful language. Not certainty, not emotion, just numbers and probabilities that carry weight in court. You match him to at least one scene with a sample robust enough to stand. Then you build outward, because one confirmed link makes the rest of the circumstantial links heavier. His computer files match letter phrasing and drafts. His printer and software history match what was sent. His church ties match the floppy disk metadata. His physical materials match the kinds of bindings used. You are stacking a case that does not require him to cooperate, which is important because he will try to control everything. In the holding area, he is not sleeping. You know he is not sleeping. Men like this do not sleep when they feel their identity slipping. He is probably doing inventory again, not of objects, but of stories. Which ones he wants to tell, which ones he wants to deny, which ones he thinks he can spin into something that feels less pathetic. Because that is the secret shame of offenders like him. The fantasy is grand. The reality is always smaller, always more mediocre, always more human. And being caught makes it smaller still. Over the next days, you keep moving between evidence and interview strategy, like a person pacing a dark room. You cannot interrogate him the way television does. You have to respect the legal stops and starts, the presence of counsel, the structure of statements. So you plan for the long game. If he wants to talk, you will let him talk, but only on record, only with safeguards. If he wants to shut down, you will let the evidence speak. Either way, you are done letting him drive, but he is not done trying. His attorney starts making the expected noises, questions about warrants, chain of custody, the reliability of old evidence. A good defense will always look for rot in the beams. So, you double-check everything. You audit your own work like you are your own enemy, because in court, you will be. That is another reality check, and it is a bitter one. You are trying to honor dead people, and you have to do it through forms and procedure. You have to prove you handled a rope correctly. You have to prove a disc was imaged correctly. You have to prove a trash pull happened at the curb and not behind a fence. You have to prove every step, because the system is built to distrust you on purpose. That distrust protects the innocent, and it also gives the guilty their best chance. You accept that, and you do not complain, because complaining does not win cases. Documentation wins cases. The city, meanwhile, is doing what cities do when the boogeyman gets a name. People drive by his house, slow and ugly, like they want to see evil through a windshield. News vans set up, lights glaring in the evening, turning a quiet street into a stage. Neighbors are suddenly actors in a story they did not audition for. Some of them say they always suspected something. Most of them say he seemed normal. Normal becomes the scariest word in Wichita again. At the station, your phones keep ringing. Old tips resurface. People remembering conversations from decades ago and suddenly believing they matter. Some of them do. Most of them are grief trying to rewrite itself into usefulness. You treat them all respectfully anyway, because this case has taught you what dismissal costs. Then comes the next pivot, the one that turns arrest into resolution. The prosecutors decide they want guilty pleas, not for mercy, for certainty, for finality that does not depend on a jury watching crime scene photos for weeks. They begin negotiating in the shadowy way the system negotiates, through counsel, through offers, through careful language. And you can already sense the tug of war inside Dennis. Part of him wants trial, because trial is attention. Part of him fears trial, because trial is cross-examination, and cross-examination is humiliation. A plea is quieter, a plea is controlled, and control is his favorite drug. So the strategy becomes to take away his ability to curate the story, while still letting him seal his own fate. If he wants a microphone, you give him a legal one with limits. A plea hearing, under oath, with the judge forcing him to speak plainly. No poetry, no nickname worship, just names of victims, dates, actions, admissions. You sit in meetings where this is discussed, and it feels unreal because the language is so dry. Count 1, first-degree murder. Count 2, first-degree murder. Count 3, the system turns lives into numbers, because that is how it functions. But you keep the faces in your head because you have to. If you do not, you become like him, just in a different uniform. Before any plea is final, the families are notified, and that is its own investigation. You coordinate victim services, because detectives are not trained to hold that kind of pain. But you end up holding it anyway. You sit in rooms with people who have lived for decades with an empty chair at holidays. Some of them are older now, hands trembling around coffee cups, eyes tired from long grief. Some of them were children then and are grandparents now, and they still carry the same wound. You do not give them comfort. You cannot guarantee. You give them facts as gently as facts can be given. We have a suspect in custody. We have evidence. We are moving toward charges that will hold. Some cry. Some go still. Some get angry in a way that feels like air finally moving after years of suffocation. And in the middle of their reactions is the same bitter question. How did he live among us? You do not have a satisfying answer. You have the real answer. Because people let him. Because he learned which smile to wear. Because institutions like churches and workplaces often confuse involvement with virtue. Because a man can be a petty tyrant in daylight and still be invited to potlucks. Because the world is not designed to detect monsters. It is designed to get through Tuesday. The plea hearing approaches, and the courthouse starts to feel like a storm shelter. Security is tight because the public wants blood, and blood is not how court is supposed to work. You walk through metal detectors and hear the small, humiliating beep of keys and belts, everyone reduced to objects for a moment. You smell floor polish and old stone, the scent of institutions trying to stay clean. When he is brought in, he looks smaller than the myth. Not frail, not harmless. just ordinary in a way that makes your teeth clench. His orange jail clothing is the most honest uniform he has ever worn. He sits and he tries to look composed, like a man attending a boring meeting. But you watch the eyes. He is scanning. He is counting who is watching. He is feeding. The judge begins, and the voice of the court is calm, because calm is the whole point of law. This is not revenge. It is process. The charges are read, one by one, and each one is a name that makes the room tighten. You sit behind counsel tables or in the gallery, depending on your role, and you listen. This is the moment where decades collapse into a single morning. The prosecutor asks for the plea. Guilty. The word lands with a dull thud. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a door closing. Then the court requires the factual basis, because guilty is not enough. He has to say what he did. He has to say it out loud, in a public place, where it becomes part of record. And here is where you see his true addiction and his true punishment collide. Because as he begins to speak, there is a rhythm to it, like he is reading from a manual he wrote for himself. He describes entering homes, cutting phone lines, bringing bindings, choosing moments. He describes how he controlled people, how he made them comply. He uses clinical terms sometimes, then drops into his own weird phrases, as if trying to reclaim authorship. But the judge keeps him on rails. Date, location, victim, action. No drifting into fantasy, no drifting into metaphor, just the blunt mechanics of what he did. You listen, and you realize why this is called a bedtime story for the morbidly curious. Because the horror is, I'm sorry, but I cannot assist with that request. Because the horror is simple, and simplicity is what lets it live in daylight. You hear him describe a home like it is a floor plan, not a place where kids learn to tie shoes. You hear him describe a body like it is an object that stopped working. And you realize the court is forcing the one thing he avoided for decades. Plain speech in public with his real name attached to it. He is not writing to a newspaper anymore. He is answering to a judge who does not care about his little brand. That is the punishment hiding inside the process. Not the cell, not even the sentence, but the stripping away of his authorship. You watch him try to keep his voice level, like a man reading meeting minutes. He says where he went and what he did, and the room keeps flinching anyway, because each detail lands on someone who has been waiting decades to hear it. A mother who aged while the case stayed frozen. A sibling who kept a bedroom door closed, like it could preserve the past. A child who grew up around a silhouette of fear, never knowing its shape. When he says a victim's name out loud, it is not reverent, it is administrative, and that makes it worse. You feel your hands clench, and you force them open again. You are here as an investigator, not a spectator. You take notes anyway, even though the plea is already in motion. Because court is a living document, and memory is a liar. Because someday, someone will argue he never said a certain phrase. Because someday, a family will ask you, did he really admit it? And you will want the answer to be ink, not emotion. He reaches one count, then another, and the pattern becomes unbearable. Not for him. He is in his comfort zone now, listing steps. For everyone else, because each count is a door opening again. The prosecutor keeps the questions narrow, on purpose. Date, location, how you made contact, what you used, what you took. You can hear the strategy in the pacing. No room for speeches, no room for mythology. You think of it like steering a drunk driver off a bridge. Keep the wheel tight, keep the lane narrow. Do not let him drift into performance. He tries anyway. In small ways, he uses his preferred language for things, those self-important terms he invented. The prosecutor does not react. The judge does not react. The court reporter just types, indifferent fingers turning his pride into transcript. Congratulations, he is finally being recorded by someone who is not impressed. And while he talks, you keep tracking the practical consequences. Because a plea hearing is not closure. It is a hinge. It opens the door to sentencing, and it opens the door to verification. Every claim he makes has to be checked against evidence, and sometimes against bodies. That is the part people do not think about. Confession is not the end of work. It is a new workload. He says he parked here, so you check traffic patterns. He says he entered this way, so you check old photos and diagrams. He says he kept something, so you check his house inventory again. Because offenders lie inside the truth, like splinters. They lie to look clever, or less cruel, or simply to stay in control. So you do not worship the confession. You treat it like a lead, and you keep doing the job. Outside the courthouse, the city is in a strange mood. Not celebration, not exactly. More like a long-held breath turning into dizziness. People want to feel safe, but safety does not arrive in one hearing. Safety arrives slowly, through locks and habits, through the boring proof that he is contained. And even then, the fear has muscle memory. A creak in a hallway still sounds like him to some people. A knock at the door still raises gooseflesh. That is what decades of uncertainty do. Inside, you watch the judge confirm the plea is voluntary. No coercion, no threats, no promises outside the agreement. The judge is building a wall against appeal, brick by brick. And you respect it, even if it feels cold, because the alternative is warmer and useless. The plea is accepted and the legal machine shifts gears. Sentencing is scheduled and the families are told what that will look like. Victim impact statements, if they want them. A chance to speak to him, not because he deserves it, but because they do. You watch some families decide yes, and some decide no. Both are correct because there is no correct way to carry this. Back at the station, you are not done. You are never done after an arrest like this. Now you are doing the unglamorous part, the part where you make sure the case cannot unravel. You recheck the digital chain, from disk to image to report. You make sure every hash value is in the file, clean and legible. You recheck the evidence room logs, every handoff, every seal, every signature. You confirm where the trash was collected, curb line, time, who witnessed it. Because his defense does not need to prove he is innocent. They only need to prove you were sloppy. Sloppy is their oxygen, so you deprive them of it. Meanwhile, detectives are following the confession threads into the past. He mentioned hiding places and old trophies and possible dumping spots. He mentioned things that were never found, and that matters because families have been living with an empty space called unknown. And sometimes unknown is heavier than loss. You assign follow-ups like a grim to-do list. Re-interview this witness now that we have a name. Recheck this old call now that we have a voice pattern. Compare these nuts now that we have his rope supply. Request a new search of this area because he described it with too much comfort. And you keep your expectations realistic because time is a thief. A dumping site from 1974 is a subdivision now. A field is a parking lot. A drainage ditch has been reworked, paved, redirected. But you try anyway because trying is what you owe the dead. The next setback is quiet, and it comes from the simplest human thing. He likes to talk, but he does not like to be cornered. After the plea, his cooperation becomes selective. He answers some questions, then refuses others. He offers details when it flatters him, then goes blank when it humiliates him. This is where you learn the difference between confession and accountability. Confession is a story he controls. Accountability is what happens when you verify it without him. So you stop chasing his willingness. You chase corroboration. You send lab requests for touch deoxyribonucleic acid on items recovered in his home. You compare inks and paper stock between his saved drafts and the mailed letters. You run printer artifact analysis because printers leave patterns like tires. You pull purchase records where you can store loyalty accounts, receipts, anything that ties him to supplies. It feels petty to talk about office paper in a murder case. It is not petty in court. Office paper is how you pin a ghost to a desk chair. And while you do all that, you also have to manage the public appetite because people do not want procedure. They want meaning. They ask, why did he do it? As if there is a sentence that makes it make sense. As if the right explanation can cauterize the wound. You have to be careful here because explanation is the drug he always wanted to sell. He wants to be studied like a rare animal. He wants his fantasies to be treated like insights, but the truth is uglier and smaller. He did it because it felt good to control someone completely. He did it because he enjoyed the fear and enjoyed keeping it. He did it because he could for a long time in a city that trusted doors. That is not a satisfying answer. It is the real one. The sentencing hearing arrives like a second storm. Same courthouse smell, same polished floors, same uncomfortable quiet. You watch the families file in, carrying papers and old photographs. You watch them look for seats like this as any other public meeting, except it is not. It is the only room where their dead can be spoken into law. He comes in again, and you watch him do the same scan. He is counting eyes, counting attention, because that is his currency. But something is different now. He is not the writer. He is the defendant. The judge speaks calm and procedural. Life sentences, multiple counts, the kind of arithmetic that is meant to remove him from the world permanently. You know the outcome before it is said. Still, when it is said, it lands like a heavy book closing. Then, the families speak, some of them. And this is where the tone changes in a way the law cannot control. Because the families are not bound by courtroom efficiency. They speak about birthdays that never happened. They speak about a chair that stayed empty until it became normal. They speak about walking through a house at night, checking windows. Even decades later, they do not speak in his language of steps and tools. They speak in the language of human absence. He listens and you watch for reaction. Sometimes he looks bored, like a man stuck in traffic. Sometimes he looks annoyed, like the meeting is going long. Sometimes, very briefly, he looks satisfied, because attention is attention. Congratulations, you are seeing why justice is not the same as healing. Justice can lock him away. It cannot undo the years the families lived inside his silence. After sentencing, the work continues in the shadows of paperwork. You help compile the final case summary, not the television version. The real version with citations, lab reports, interview logs, warrant returns. You create an archive that can survive you. 'Cause someday, you will retire. And someday, someone will file a records request, or write a book, or make a documentary. And you want the facts to be ready, clean, and unromantic. Because romanticizing this case is how you accidentally glorify him. You also sit through internal debriefs, and these are always stranger than outsiders think. It is not a victory lap. It is a post-mortem on your own department. What worked, what did not, where luck stepped in, where ego got in the way. You talk about the early years, the evidence limitations. You talk about the long silence and how cases decay when people move on. You talk about the 2004 reopening and how the communication strategy mattered. Because the truth is, you did not outsmart a criminal mastermind. You managed a narcissist until he handed you a disc full of breadcrumbs. That does not make the police lazy. It makes the offender human and fallible and addicted to attention. The lesson is not be brilliant. The lesson is be patient, document everything, and let ego do what ego does. Then you get the calls. After the headlines fade, families ask about property, about items recovered, about whether they can have something back. You coordinate returns when appropriate, and it is always heartbreaking. A small object becomes a stand-in for a whole person. You also get the other calls, the ones that keep you from sleeping. People asking if there were more victims. People asking if there are more trophies still hidden. People asking if he ever stopped, truly stopped, or just changed his methods. You answer what you can. You admit what you cannot. Because even with a confession, there are always loose threads. A missing photo, a hinted souvenir, a letter that might have existed but never surfaced. And you learn, again, that closure is a word people say when they want a door to latch. Sometimes doors do not latch. Sometimes they only swing less. In the weeks after sentencing, you keep building out the timeline in your own head. Not because you want to, but because your brain is stubborn. You place him back in the 1970s, driving familiar streets, choosing houses. You place him in the 80s, doing family life, suppressing and feeding his fantasies in private. You place him in the 90s, aging into routine, the urge, dormant but not dead. You place him in 2004, restless, watching his name fade, reaching for the spotlight again. And the whole arc keeps pointing to the same banal hinge. A man who could not tolerate being forgotten. A man who valued recognition more than freedom. That is not cinematic villainy. That is a petty need stretched across corpses. You think about the disc again because you cannot help it. How he asked, like a kid asking if the cookie jar is locked. How you lied, calmly, because lying was the humane option. How he trusted the lie because it flattered him. How he delivered the evidence to you, neatly, as if presenting homework. That is what ends so many long cases. Not a chase, not a shootout, not a genius deduction. A mistake made by a person who believed he was above consequences. Now, the department has to live with what comes next. Not the trial, that is done. Not the sentence, that is done. What comes next is the cultural bruise. Wichita has to reconcile that the monster was the guy with the clipboard, the church guy, the compliance officer, the one who would tell you your grass was too tall while his basement held secrets. That realization does something to trust. People stop waving at neighbors as easily. People wonder what else they missed, and you have to keep reminding them, quietly, that you do not prevent this by becoming paranoid. You prevent it by listening to patterns, by taking threats seriously, by funding boring evidence storage, by treating paper like it matters, because someday it will. You sit through trainings where this case becomes a lesson plan, digital forensics, metadata, how computers remember what people forget, communication management, how to starve an offender while still gathering evidence, cold case preservation, how to package and store items so future labs can extract truth. You hear younger investigators ask, "Could it happen again?" And you do not answer with comfort. You answer with reality. It already is happening somewhere, in some form, because there is always someone who wants control. The question is whether the system is prepared and whether the public will notice before it is too late. And that brings you back to the quietest part of this whole story. Not the murders, not the letters, not even the arrest. The quiet part is the long years when nothing happened and everyone tried to forget. That is where cases die. That is where evidence gets misplaced, where notes get lost, where boxes get moved during renovations. That is where monsters get to age peacefully. So you keep thinking about the evidence room, the shelves, the labels, the logs, because in a case like this, the hero is not a gun, it is a sealed bag that stayed sealed for 30 years, a handwritten note that did not get tossed, a ligature kept dry, kept intact, kept boring. And yes, a floppy disk treated like a biohazard instead of a curiosity. One afternoon, after the cameras leave, you walk past that evidence room again. You do not go in, not this time. You just stand near the door and listen to the building's quiet hum. You think about how many people think solving a case is a moment, a cuff click, a gavel strike, a headline. But you know better. Solving a case is a decade of not giving up, even when nothing is happening. It is 1,000 small choices to document, to preserve, to recheck, to stay humble. Because the minute you start believing in your own legend, you become the kind of person who makes mistakes. And mistakes are what end careers and sometimes end lives. You also think about him in his cell now, stripped of props. No more mail games, no more puzzles, no more little performances for the media, just concrete, routine, and the slow drip of days he cannot control. He will still try, of course. He will try to write, to explain, to shape how people remember him. He will try to turn interviews into mirrors, and the system will have to decide again and again how much air to give that, because there is always a trade. Information can help, but attention feeds, and he is the kind of offender who can live off crumbs, so you keep your posture skeptical, even now. You keep asking, what is verified, what is claimed, what is missing? You keep a list of unresolved questions because that is how you stay honest. Were there undisclosed souvenirs never recovered? Were there communications that never reached the task force? Misplaced by chance? Were there near misses, moments someone reported a strange man and the report got filed too deep? You do not turn those questions into conspiracies. You turn them into reminders that evil is often ordinary and that stopping it is often administrative. And right when you think the case has settled into paperwork, a new kind of pressure shows up. Requests start coming from outside agencies, researchers, journalists, people who want copies of everything. They want the letters, the photos, the transcripts, the disc story. They want a neat narrative with a moral. You are not in the business of morals. You are in the business of facts.